Mugabe's last son, Bellarmine, was recently arrested in South Africa after an employee at his Hyde Park house was shot. It was a very messy situation. His cousin eventually pleaded guilty to attempted murder. Bellarmine himself pleaded guilty to immigration offenses and pointing a firearm during a separate altercation. He was fined and he was deported back to Zimbabwe. This is not Bellarmine's first controversy, okay? But when I saw his face this time, I wasn't thinking about him. For some reason, I was thinking about his mother, Grace Mugabe, Gucci Grace, the woman who went from being Robert Mugabe's secretary to becoming his second wife, to becoming one of the most controversial first ladies in Africa. Let me tell you a little bit about Grace. It was the early 90s, and Robert Mugabe was already one of the most powerful men in Africa, okay? He had ruled Zimbabwe since 1980, and to many people, he was viewed as a liberation hero, the man who had helped to end white minority rule in Zimbabwe. And beside him, through all of that, was his wife, Sally Mugabe. Sally was not just the first wife. She had been with Mugabe long before the presidential title, the motorcades, all of that. She was there through his prison years, the liberation struggle, the early years of Zimbabwe's independence. And their marriage also carried some pain. They actually had a son together earlier, but he died as a baby from malaria while Mugabe was still imprisoned. That really devastated both of them. And for years, Sally remained the woman that many Zimbabweans associated with Mugabe's sacrifices, his early struggles. Around this same period, a young secretary called Grace Marufu was working inside the president's office. By this point, Mugabe was already in his late 60s, Sally was about 60, and Grace was in her 20s. Grace was married to an Air Force pilot called Stanley Goreraza, and together they had a child. So to be clear, Robert Mugabe was married to Sally, and Grace was married to Stanley. So when Robert and Grace got together, it was a full-blown affair on both sides. Whatever attempts were made to keep it quiet didn't last long because Grace got pregnant. Then what made the whole thing even harder to ignore was the child's name, Bona. Her daughter was named after Robert Mugabe's own mother. Then Grace got pregnant again, and she had another child for Mugabe, Robert Jr. In 1992, Sally Mugabe died from kidney failure. Zimbabwe mourned her deeply. Even people who later turned against Robert Mugabe, they still tended to speak about Sally with this warmth, with sympathy. Now, the relationship between Mugabe and Grace did not suddenly end with his first wife's death. It continued openly this time. By this point, Mugabe was already heading into his 70s and Grace was in her early 30s. Then in 1996, they officially got married. The wedding was huge, lavish, expensive. Thousands of guests attended. The event drew massive attention across Zimbabwe. Some people even called it the wedding of the century. At first, Grace mostly stayed in the background politically after their wedding. Back then, most people just knew her as Mugabe's much younger wife, the glamorous first lady, always surrounded by luxury, designer clothes, expensive shopping sprees. But as the years went on, Grace started changing publicly and people noticed. By this point, Robert Mugabe was already deep into his 80s, still ruling Zimbabwe decades after independence. Then Zimbabwe's economy started collapsing badly, and I mean quite badly. At one point, during the hyperinflation crisis, prices were changing so fast that some people needed actual bags full of cash just to buy basic food. People's savings became almost worthless overnight. While ordinary Zimbabweans were struggling like this, stories about Grace's lifestyle kept spreading. Luxury shopping trips, designer brands, expensive jewelry, multiple properties, Rolls Royces for her sons. At one point, Grace was even placed under sanctions by the United States and the European Union. Those sanctions were aimed at members of Mugabe's government who were accused of corruption, undermining democracy, and human rights abuses. Grace denied any wrongdoing, but to her critics, she was spending too much, she was doing too much. There seemed to be no limit to what Grace could buy. That was when the nickname really exploded, Gucci Grace. And honestly, at some point, Zimbabweans were not finding the nickname funny anymore. It became symbolic. To them, Grace represented a political elite living in extreme luxury while ordinary people suffered. But to be fair, even some of Grace's critics acknowledged that she was involved in charitable projects, including an orphanage and a school in Mazoe. In that way, she helped. But the controversies kept piling up. There was a time when Grace signed up for a PhD to the University of Zimbabwe. After a few months, the university handed her the certificate for the PhD. No thesis, just done. She did her PhD in like 3 months. People questioned how. Her supporters defended that degree. They said that she actually finished and people were just spreading misinformation. How about when she enrolled in a university in China to study Chinese language? This was in 2007. By the time she graduated in 2011, Grace said she still couldn't speak Chinese fluently. Critics loved that so much. By now, everything that Grace did had become controversial. And then there was her mouth. Oh my goodness. Grace, she was known for making some incredibly bold public statements. At one point, she famously declared that Robert Mugabe was so popular that he could run for election as a corpse, as a dead person, and still win. That tells you about the confidence surrounding the Mugabe family at that time, you know? But the real turning point came when Grace stopped acting like somebody who was simply married to power. She started acting like somebody who wanted power for herself. In 2014, when Mugabe was around 90 years old, Grace officially entered frontline politics after becoming the head of ZANU-PF's Women's League. Inside of ZANU-PF, that was the ruling party, there were already powerful men quietly preparing for the day that Robert Mugabe would either step down or die. And one of the biggest names was Emmerson Mnangagwa. He was a long-time ally to Mugabe. He was a liberation war figure, a man that many people inside of Zimbabwe feared and respected. And many people saw him as the obvious successor, you know. But around Grace Mugabe, another faction had started growing, a younger political group that became known as the G40. Now, the critics of this G40 believed that they were trying to stop Mnangagwa from succeeding Mugabe, and they were trying to clear a path for a different future after Mugabe. This path that they were trying to clear looks like they wanted Grace to lead Zimbabwe. Then Grace started going after senior politicians publicly. At rallies, she would openly insult and attack people within her husband's own party. Some officials lost their jobs after falling out with her. Others suddenly found themselves accused of disloyalty. And the scary part was, people could not always tell whether Mugabe fully agreed with Grace or whether Grace just had a lot of influence over her aging husband. Then in 2017, things exploded. Robert Mugabe suddenly fired Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa. That decision changed everything. The military was furious. Many top military figures supported Mnangagwa, or at the very least, they trusted him over Grace and over the G40 faction. To them, Grace represented a dangerous shift in power. She had not fought in Zimbabwe's liberation war. She was much younger than the old political guard, you know. Yet suddenly she seemed to be standing right at the center of Zimbabwe's succession battle. Then Zimbabwe's military commander, Constantino Chiwenga, he made a public warning. He basically warned Mugabe's faction to stop purging liberation war figures and senior party members like Mnangagwa. In other words, the military was signaling, back off before this situation gets worse. But that warning did nothing. Just days later, Mugabe fired Mnangagwa anyway. After that, the military moved in. At first, Mugabe refused to step down. Even after the military vehicles rolled into Harare, he still appeared on television, trying to look calm, trying to look in control. And the military kept insisting, this is not a coup. This is not a coup. They claimed that they were only targeting criminals around Mugabe. By this point, most people could already see what was happening. Robert Mugabe was losing power. By now, Mugabe was about 93 years old. The military was against him. Large crowds of Zimbabweans, they were flooding the streets, celebrating, demanding change. Even members of his own party were beginning to turn on him. Then ZANU-PF removed him as party leader. And suddenly, after nearly 40 years in power, Robert Mugabe's political empire started collapsing in real time. Finally, on November 21st, 2017, Mugabe resigned, and Mnangagwa, the one that Grace's faction had tried to block from power, was now about to become president. Just like that, Grace Mugabe's political rise collapsed with her husband's presidency. Former allies distanced themselves from them, and people who had once praised Grace suddenly disappeared. After all of that, the Mugabes still did not flee Zimbabwe. That surprised a lot of people, because by now Robert Mugabe had been ruling for about 40 years. And unlike some other countries and some other fallen leaders, he was not jailed and his family was not targeted. He and Grace continued living in Zimbabwe, mainly at the family's famous Blue Roof mansion in Harare. Mugabe eventually died in 2019 at the age of 95 After his death, Grace remained in Zimbabwe. She stayed out of politics and she just lived quietly in Harare. Wait, I haven't mentioned Grace Mugabe's assault cases abroad. Let's do a quick summary of them. Grace was in Hong Kong in 2009 visiting her daughter Bona, who was studying there at that time. A British photographer called Richard Jones photographed her outside a luxury hotel. According to reports, Grace's bodyguard assaulted him and Grace joined him, punching him while wearing diamond rings, She avoided prosecution though because she was granted diplomatic immunity. Then in 2017, a young South African model called Gabriella accused Grace of attacking her inside a hotel in Johannesburg after finding her around Mugabe's sons. When the photos of Gabriella's injuries hit the internet, the story exploded. Grace denied attacking her. She claimed that Gabriella had actually been the aggressive one. But honestly, what really made people angry was not just the assault. It was what happened after. Because instead of staying behind to deal with the South African legal system immediately, Grace was allowed to leave the country after receiving diplomatic immunity. Again, that decision caused so much outrage. A lot of people felt like ordinary citizens would never have been treated this way. Then later, South Africa's High Court overturned the immunity decision completely. After that, reports suggested that Grace mostly stayed away from South Africa altogether. Because now, there were serious questions about what could happen if she returned, The Mugabe children also keep finding themselves in headlines, especially Bellarmine. Over the years, he has become known online for flashy luxury posts, expensive cars, designer lifestyles, controversies here and there. So when his name appeared in the news again in 2026 after that South African shooting case, many people were not so surprised anymore. I can't go into the entire Mugabe family drama right now. This video will never end. Anyway, ask 10 people about Grace Mugabe today and you'll probably get 10 different answers. Some people see a beautiful, ambitious woman who was blamed for far more than she deserved, Others see somebody who became the face of excess, the face of political arrogance during Mugabe's final years. But whatever side you fall on, Grace Mugabe made an impact. Was it good? Was it bad? You decide. Gucci Grace.